In 1923, a loaf of bread in Berlin cost 200 billion marks. Not 200 marks. 200 billion. Workers carried their wages home in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because the paper money was so worthless, you needed ridiculous quantities of it just to buy groceries. Children used stacks of banknotes as building blocks because paper money was cheaper than actual toy blocks. This was Germany, one of the most advanced industrial economies in the world. They had world-class scientists, engineers, universities, factories. They knew economics. They understood mathematics. They could see the inflation happening month by month, week by week, day by day, and they couldn't stop it. Here's what makes this archaeological find so fascinating. When you dig into the financial records of every major empire or nation that's ever existed, you find the same pattern. Rome in the 200s AD, revolutionary France in the 1790s, Hungary in 1946, which holds the record for the worst hyperinflation ever recorded, where prices doubled every 15 hours, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela right now. They all knew inflation was destroying their economies. They all had smart people trying to stop it. They all tried price controls, currency reforms, new economic policies, and inflation won anyway, every single time. So what is going on here? Why does inflation seem to be this unstoppable force that eventually defeats every attempt to control it? We're going to explore 4 key questions. First, what actually is inflation, and why do governments create it in the first place? Second, why does inflation always start as a solution to a different problem, and then become the problem itself? Third, what does the archaeological record, the actual financial data from collapsed currencies, tell us about how inflation spirals out of control? And fourth, what does this pattern tell us about the current wave of inflation we're experiencing now? Let's dig into the historical record. Cool, so let's start with the basics. Inflation is the decrease in the purchasing power of money over time. Your dollar buys less next year than it does today. Prices go up, or more accurately, the value of money goes down. Now, here's the thing that makes inflation politically attractive. It's a hidden tax. If the government raises income taxes by 10%, everyone notices and gets angry. If the government creates inflation of 10%, your money loses 10% of its purchasing power. But it feels less like theft and more like bad luck? Market forces? It's diffuse and hard to pin on anyone specifically. More importantly, inflation is a way to reduce the real value of debt. If you owe $100 and then create 10% inflation, you still owe $100 nominally, but the real value of that debt has decreased by 10%. For a government with massive debts, this is incredibly tempting. And this is where the pattern begins. Excavate the financial records of any empire that experienced severe inflation, and you'll find the same origin story. The government had more obligations than it had revenue, usually because of war, sometimes because of corruption or mismanagement, occasionally because of genuine emergencies like plague or famine. Rome in the 200s AD needed to pay soldiers to defend expanding borders. Revolutionary France in the 1790s needed to finance wars against European monarchies. Weimar Germany in the 1920s needed to pay World War I reparations. Zimbabwe in the 2000s was funding land redistribution and military intervention in Congo. Venezuela in the 2010s was maintaining subsidies and social programs after oil revenues collapsed. The specific circumstances differ, but the mechanism is always the same. Government spending exceeds revenue. Borrowing becomes difficult or expensive, so the government turns to the printing press. Sometimes literally, physically printing more paper money. Sometimes through currency debasement, putting less precious metal in coins. sometimes through modern central banking, expanding the money supply through various financial mechanisms. And here's the crucial part. It works at first. That's why governments keep doing it. You print money, you can pay your soldiers or your debts or your social programs, and the immediate crisis is averted. The inflation takes time to materialize. There's a lag between money creation and price increases. During that lag, it looks like you've solved the problem for free. But you haven't. You've just started a process that's very difficult to stop. All right, let's look at Rome, because the denarius inflation is probably the best documented currency collapse in ancient history, and it set the template for every inflation that came after. In 64 AD, under Emperor Nero, the silver content in the denarius was about 93 to 95% pure silver. By 100 AD, it was still around 85%. By 200 AD, about 50%. By 250 AD, roughly 5%. By 270 AD, the denarius was basically a bronze coin with a thin silver coating that wore off almost immediately. Why did this happen? Rome's military expenses kept increasing. The empire was constantly fighting on multiple frontiers: Germania, Parthia, Britain, North Africa. Every time there was a military crisis, the emperors needed more money to pay soldiers and fund campaigns. But raising taxes was politically dangerous. Several emperors were assassinated partially because of tax revolts, so they debased the currency instead. Reduce the silver content by 10%, mint the same number of coins, and suddenly you have 10% more purchasing power from the same amount of silver. Problem solved, right? Except merchants weren't stupid. When the denarius had less silver, they charged more denarii for their goods. The archaeologist Kevin Butcher has tracked surviving price data from this period, and you can see the pattern clearly. As silver content declined, prices expressed in denarii increased proportionally. By the 200s AD, Rome was caught in what modern economists would call a classic inflation spiral. Prices were rising, so the government needed more money to pay for the same things, so they debased the currency further, which caused prices to rise more, which required more debasement. Emperor Diocletian tried to stop this in 301 AD with his famous price edict. He simply made it illegal to charge more than the maximum price he set for over 1,000 different goods and services. The penalty for violation was death. Did it work? No. Obviously not. You cannot legislate away the loss of confidence in a currency. What actually happened, based on archaeological evidence of marketplace behavior, is that people stopped using denarii for major transactions. They reverted to barter, used old high silver coins from a century earlier, or demanded payment in goods rather than currency. Diocletian eventually had to introduce a completely new currency system based on gold solidity. The denarius was abandoned. Inflation had won. Now let's jump forward about 1,500 years to revolutionary France, because this one's particularly instructive. France in the 1790s had some of the best economists and mathematicians in the world. The Enlightenment had happened. These people understood compound interest and monetary theory. They thought they could manage inflation scientifically. They were wrong. In 1789, revolutionary France faced a fiscal crisis. The monarchy had left massive debts, the revolution had disrupted tax collection, and France was going to war with most of Europe. The solution? The assignat, a new paper currency backed by land confiscated from the church and aristocracy. This seemed like sound economics. The assignats weren't just paper money printed from nothing. They were explicitly backed by real assets. Land. Productive land. You could even use assignats to purchase the land directly. It was almost like a bond that functioned as currency. The initial issue was for 400 million livres. The government promised this would be the maximum. The assignats would be retired as land was sold, so the money supply would actually shrink over time. Within a year, the government printed more, then more. By 1795, over 40 billion livres worth of assignats had been issued, 100 times the original amount. Why? Same reason as always. The government needed money for the war, couldn't raise taxes effectively, so they printed. By 1795, an assignat that had been worth 1 livre in gold in 1790 was worth about 0.5% of a livre. A loaf of bread that cost 2 sous in 1790 cost 225 francs in assignats in 1795. The inflation rate was measured in thousands of percent per year. The government tried price controls, just like Diocletian. The law of the maximum in 1793 set maximum prices for grain, bread, and other essentials. It didn't work. Merchants hoarded goods or sold on the black market. Food shortages became severe. The government eventually had to abandon price controls because they were making the crisis worse. In 1796, France gave up. They replaced the assignat with a new currency backed by nothing, actually, except the promise that they definitely wouldn't print too much of it this time. That currency also inflated. Eventually, Napoleon came to power and stabilized things by creating the franc, backed by gold and silver, with strict limits on issuance. What's so striking about the assignat case is that it wasn't ignorance or incompetence. French officials understood that printing money caused inflation. They had warnings from economists. They could see it happening. But the political pressure to finance the war was so intense that they kept printing anyway, always believing they could stop before it got out of hand. They couldn't. Let me hit 3 more cases quickly, because the pattern is remarkably consistent even as we move into the modern era. Weimar Germany, 1921–1923. Germany owed massive war reparations after World War I, payable in gold or foreign currency. Germany didn't have gold or foreign currency, so they printed marks, used marks to buy foreign currency, and sent that to the Allies. This was always going to cause inflation, but the alternative was admitting they couldn't pay, which had political consequences. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. The German government was printing notes in denominations up to 100 trillion marks. People were using money as wallpaper because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper. Hungary, 1945–1946, holds the world record for hyperinflation. After World War II, Hungary's economy was destroyed, the Soviet occupation was extracting resources, and the government tried to maintain spending by printing money. By July 1946, prices were doubling every 15 hours. The pengo became so worthless that Hungary had to introduce a special parallel currency called the adopengo just for tax payments because regular pengos lost value too quickly. Zimbabwe, 2000s. Robert Mugabe's government seized white-owned farms and redistributed land, which destroyed agricultural productivity. Revenue collapsed. Government spending didn't. Solution: print money. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate was estimated at 79.6 billion% per month. The government printed a $100 trillion note. People abandoned the Zimbabwe dollar entirely and started using US dollars and South African rand. In all 3 cases, the government knew it was creating inflation. They could see prices rising monthly, weekly, daily. They tried various measures to stop it: price controls, currency reforms, denominations. Nothing worked. Why? Because they never addressed the underlying problem. Government spending exceeded revenue, and printing money was the only way to cover the gap. You cannot stop inflation while simultaneously creating it. And governments stuck in fiscal crises find it almost impossible to stop creating it. Okay, so let's step back and look at the actual mechanism that makes inflation so difficult to control once it starts. Stage 1. Fiscal crisis. Government spending exceeds revenue for some reason, usually war, sometimes corruption, occasionally genuine emergency. Stage 2. First resort to inflation. Government increases money supply to cover the gap. This works initially because there's a lag between money creation and price increases. Stage 3. Prices start rising. Merchants and citizens notice that money is losing value. They begin to expect future inflation. Stage 4, and this is where it gets dangerous, expectations change behavior. If you expect prices to rise, you spend money quickly rather than holding it. If you're a merchant, you raise prices preemptively. If you're a worker, you demand higher wages. These behaviors actually cause more inflation, independent of money printing. Stage 5. The government finds itself on a treadmill. Prices have risen, so the government needs more money to buy the same goods and services. Wages have risen, so government payroll costs more. Debt payments, if fixed nominally, are the only thing getting cheaper in real terms. Stage 6. Accelerating money creation. The government has to print faster just to keep up with rising prices. A 10% money supply increase that initially created 5% inflation now creates 20% inflation because expectations have changed. Stage 7. Currency collapse. At some point, people lose confidence entirely. They refuse to accept the currency, or they demand immediate conversion to goods or foreign currency. Hyperinflation sets in. The currency dies. What makes this mechanism so pernicious is that each stage makes the next stage more likely. It's a feedback loop. The early stages can last decades. Rome took 200 years to go from Nero's first debasement to Diocletian's currency reform. But the late stages accelerate rapidly. Weimar Germany went from moderate inflation to hyperinflation in about 2 years. And here's the brutal truth. Once you're in stage 5 or 6, there's basically no way to stop the process without addressing the underlying fiscal crisis. You have to either massively cut spending, dramatically increase taxes, or default on obligations. All of these are politically catastrophic. So governments usually keep printing and hoping something changes. It never does. Inflation always wins. All right, so this is where I make everyone angry. Please like the video. I'm going to need it. Let's talk about current inflation. In 2020-2021, in response to COVID, governments around the world dramatically increased spending, while central banks expanded money supply at unprecedented rates. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from about $4 trillion in early 2020 to $9 trillion by 2022. The M2 money supply, a broad measure of money in circulation, increased by roughly 40% in 2 years. This was, by historical standards, massive money creation. And in 2021, when inflation started rising, many economists and central bankers said it was transitory, temporary, caused by supply chain disruptions, nothing to worry about. By 2022, inflation in the U.S. hit 9.1%, the highest since 1981. In the U.K., over 11%. In the Eurozone, over 10%. Suddenly, it wasn't looking so transitory. Now, 9% inflation is not Weimar Germany. It's not Zimbabwe. It's not even close to hyperinflation. But here's what makes the historical pattern relevant. We're potentially in the early stages of the mechanism I just described. Stage 1. Fiscal crisis. Many developed countries have debt-to-GDP ratios over 100%. The U.S. federal debt is over 120% of GDP. Japan is over 250%. These are peacetime debt levels that historically have only occurred during major wars. Stage 2. Resort to inflation. Check. The money printing happened. We did this. Stage 3. Prices rising. Check. We're living through this right now. Stage 4. Changing expectations. This is the crucial question. Have inflation expectations become unanchored? Are people and businesses starting to expect ongoing inflation and changing their behavior accordingly? The answer seems to be partially. Inflation has come down from the 2022 peaks. U.S. inflation was around 3 to 4% in 2023-2024. But it hasn't returned to the 2% target that central banks want. And some measures of inflation expectations have ticked up. Are we heading toward the later stages of the mechanism? I genuinely don't know. Modern central banks have tools that Rome and Weimar Germany didn't have. They can raise interest rates to slow money creation and reduce demand. The Federal Reserve has done this aggressively. Rates went from near zero to over 5% in about 18 months. But here's the uncomfortable part. Raising interest rates enough to completely kill inflation also increases the cost of servicing government debt. The U.S. federal government now spends over $800 billion annually just on interest payments, more than defense spending. If rates stay high, that number grows, which worsens the fiscal crisis, which creates pressure to print money to cover the deficit. See the trap? This doesn't mean hyperinflation is inevitable. We're nowhere near that. But it does mean we're caught in a version of the same mechanism that has trapped every government throughout history. Fiscal deficits create pressure to inflate. Inflation creates economic and political pain. Stopping inflation creates different economic and political pain. There's no easy solution. Here's the question that economic historians obsess over. Why doesn't anyone ever stop inflation before it becomes a crisis? The answer is depressingly consistent across civilizations and eras. Because the cure is more politically painful than the disease, right up until the disease becomes catastrophic. Stopping inflation requires some combination of cutting government spending, raising taxes, allowing recession and unemployment, or defaulting on obligations. Every single one of these is political suicide. Diocletian tried price controls instead, because executing merchants for price gouging was more politically acceptable than cutting military spending. Revolutionary France tried more assignats instead of admitting they couldn't afford the war. Weimar Germany tried printing faster instead of defaulting on reparations. Zimbabwe tried blaming sanctions and saboteurs instead of reversing land redistribution. The pattern is the pattern. Politicians facing the choice between create inflation now, deal with consequences later, and accept political pain now to prevent inflation later almost always choose the former. This isn't stupidity or moral failure. It's just political incentives. And by the time the inflation is bad enough that the political calculus changes, you're often already in the late stages of the mechanism where stopping it requires extreme measures. Rome eventually abandoned the denarius entirely. France eventually collapsed into Napoleon's dictatorship. Germany eventually had to destroy the mark and start over. Zimbabwe eventually abandoned its own currency. In every case, people saw it coming. In every case, smart people proposed solutions. In every case, the political system couldn't implement those solutions until it was too late. So let's come back to those questions. What is inflation? It's a hidden tax that governments use to finance spending they can't or won't fund through explicit taxation or borrowing. Why does inflation always start as a solution and become the problem? Because it creates a feedback loop where rising prices require more money creation, which causes more price rises, which requires more money creation. What does the archaeological record tell us? That once inflation accelerates beyond a certain point, it becomes almost impossible to stop without extreme measures that are politically unacceptable until the currency is already collapsing. And what does this mean now? That we're living through the early stages of a mechanism that has played out the same way across every empire and nation throughout history. I want to be very clear. I'm not predicting hyperinflation in the US or Europe or anywhere specific. The timeline for these things is uncertain. Modern central banks have more tools than ancient Rome or revolutionary France. We might navigate this successfully. But the historical pattern is the pattern. Governments facing fiscal crises turn to inflation. Inflation creates its own momentum through changed expectations and behavior. Stopping inflation requires political will to accept short-term pain. Political systems usually lack that will until the crisis is acute. Every empire that's experienced serious inflation has believed it could manage it, control it, stop it before it got out of hand. Rome thought they could debase the denarius just a little bit. France thought the assignats were different because they were backed by land. Germany thought they could print their way out of reparations and then stabilize later. Zimbabwe thought they could maintain spending and avoid inflation through price controls. They were all wrong. Inflation won. Every single time. The question isn't whether inflation is a powerful force that governments struggle to control. The archaeological evidence makes that clear. The question is whether we're witnessing the same pattern unfold in slow motion right now, or whether this time really is different because of modern monetary policy tools and institutional frameworks. I'd love to end on an optimistic note, but honesty requires acknowledging that every generation has believed they were smarter than history, and most of them were wrong. The fiscal deficits exist. The debt levels are real. The money creation happened. The inflation started. We're at least several stages into the mechanism. Whether we stop it before reaching the later stages, or whether we follow the same path as Rome and France and Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe, depends on political choices that haven't been made yet. Check back in 20 years, and we'll see how it turned out. If you found this valuable, or if you think I'm completely wrong about the comparison between current inflation and historical hyperinflations, please like the video and let me know in the comments. If you want more economic archaeology, examining how historical patterns play out across civilizations, that's what this channel is all about. Thanks for watching.